The September rain came down hard on Dustwell's red dirt streets, turning them into rivers of mud that swallowed boots whole and made the wooden sidewalks slick as ice. The afternoon stagecoach from St. Louis was 3 hours late, its wheels caked thick with prairie clay, its passengers bone-weary from the jarring ride across Kansas territory. Joanna Lynette Hart stepped down from the coach with careful precision, her traveling dress already splattered with mud from where the wheels had churned up the road. She clutched a worn carpetbag in one hand and a torn envelope in the other, her knuckles white against the rain-darkened fabric. The driver tossed her trunk down with little ceremony, and it landed with a splash in a puddle that soaked through her boots instantly. "That's as far as we go, miss," he called down, already eager to get his horses to the livery stable. "Welcome to Dustwell." Welcome. The word hung in the air like a cruel joke as Joanna watched the stagecoach lumber away, leaving her standing alone on the platform. The train depot loomed before her, its paint peeling in long strips that exposed weathered wood beneath. Windows stared out like empty eyes, most of them boarded up or broken. This wasn't the bustling frontier town she'd imagined during those long months of correspondence. She unfolded the letter again, though the rain was already making the ink run. "Meet me at the Dustwell Hotel." It had said, "I'll have everything arranged for our new life together." But Charles Morrison's promises had proven as substantial as smoke. The hotel clerk had never heard of him, had no reservation under either name, and worse, demanded payment up front for even the smallest room. Joanna counted her remaining coins for the third time. $7.43. It had seemed like enough when she'd left Philadelphia, but the journey had eaten through her savings like a plague of locusts. The hotel wanted $2 a night, meals not included. The boarding house down the street, with its peeling yellow paint and suspicious stains on the porch, still wanted $1.50. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and the rain intensified. She pressed herself against the depot wall, seeking what little shelter the narrow overhang provided. Her dress, once a respectable blue wool suitable for traveling, now clung to her frame like a second skin. Water ran in rivulets from the brim of her bonnet, which had lost most of its shape miles ago. The street was nearly empty. A few cowboys hurried past, their heads down and hat brims pulled low. A woman peered out from the millinery shop across the way, then quickly drew her curtains when she saw Joanna looking back. This was how it started, the look of a woman alone, without connections, without a clear purpose. She'd seen it happen to others in Philadelphia, women who'd taken one wrong turn and found themselves sliding down a path they'd never intended to travel. The abandoned freight shed attached to the depot caught her eye. Its door hung askew on rusty hinges, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. She hesitated, propriety warring with desperation. Ladies didn't sleep in freight sheds. Ladies had homes or hotels, or at least respectable boarding houses. But ladies also had money, or family, or husbands who kept their promises. She pushed through the gap, her carpetbag catching on a splinter that tore another hole in its already threadbare fabric. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old grain and rat droppings. But it was dry, mostly dry. Water dripped steadily through several holes in the roof, but there were corners that remained untouched by the rain. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through cracks in the walls. Old grain sacks lay piled in one corner, mice chewed but potentially useful as bedding. A broken chair leaned against the far wall, one leg missing but the seat intact. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Joanna sank down onto the grain sacks, her wet skirts pooling around her. She should be planning her next move. Should be thinking about finding work or tracking down Charles or figuring out how to get back east. But exhaustion weighed on her like a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders and making her eyelids heavy. She'd written to her aunt before leaving, burning that bridge with words she couldn't take back. "I'm going to marry Charles and live a real life, not waste away as an unpaid seamstress in your back room." The irony tasted bitter now, at least in Philadelphia. She'd had a roof that didn't leak and soup that, while thin, came regularly. The rain drummed harder on the tin roof, and somewhere in the walls, mice scurried about their business. Joanna pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them like a child seeking comfort. 24 years old, and here she was, reduced to seeking shelter like a stray dog. "If I sleep here tonight," she whispered to the empty shed, her voice barely audible above the rain, "don't judge me." The words felt like a prayer, though she wasn't sure who she was praying to anymore. Not God, who seemed to have forgotten about her somewhere around Missouri. Not her late parents, whose memory she dishonored with this foolish adventure. Maybe to herself, to the Joanna who'd once had dreams and standards and a belief that hard work and virtue would be rewarded. She arranged the grain sacks as best she could, creating a makeshift bed that smelled of mold and rodents but was softer than the wooden floor. Her carpet bag became a pillow, the torn letter tucked inside where it couldn't hurt her anymore, or at least where she couldn't see it. Outside, Dustwell was settling into evening. The rain had driven most folks indoors, though she could hear the distant sound of a piano from what was probably a saloon. Laughter drifted on the wind, male voices raised in some drinking song. For a moment, she considered it walking into that saloon, finding work the way desperate women did, but she pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders and pushed the thought away. Not yet. She wasn't that desperate yet. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd find decent work. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to survive in this godforsaken town. Tomorrow she'd become someone other than the fool who'd believed a stranger's letters and traveled 2,000 miles for a lie. But tonight, she would sleep in an abandoned freight shed, with mice for company and rain for a lullaby. And she would try very hard not to judge herself for it, even as she knew the rest of the world would. The wagon wheels creaked to a halt outside the depot just as the last light was fading from the storm-dark sky. Matthew Colton sat still for a moment, rain streaming off his hat brim, watching the abandoned building. He'd come to town for supplies, but the general store had closed early on account of the weather. Now he faced the 3-mile ride back to his ranch through mud that would be ankle-deep by the time he got home. His horses, Buck and Belle, stood patient in the downpour, their dark coats slick with rain. They'd been through worse together blizzards that could freeze a man solid, summer heat that baked the prairie grass to dust. A little rain wasn't going to bother them none, but Matthew knew better than to push good horses through uncertain ground in the dark. That's when he saw her just a shadow at first, pressed against the depot wall like she was trying to become part of the weathered wood. A woman alone, soaked through, clutching what looked like a carpet bag. Everything about her posture spoke of exhaustion and defeat. Matthew had learned to mind his own business. 3 years of widowhood had taught him that lesson well enough. Get involved in other folks' troubles, and soon enough you'd be drowning in them yourself. But something about the way she held herself, spine straight despite everything, made him pause. He climbed down from the wagon, his boots splashing in the puddles that had formed in the rutted street. The woman tensed as he approached, and he stopped a respectful distance away, rain pattering on his oilcloth coat. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her head where her bonnet had failed to protect it. Her dress had once been quality, he could tell by the cut and the remnants of fine stitching, but travel and weather had taken their toll. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with a directness that surprised him. Most women in distress either pleaded or looked away. This one did neither. "Sir," she responded, her voice steady despite the shiver he could see running through her frame. "Storm's getting worse," Matthew observed, glancing at the sky. "You waiting on someone?" "No." The word came out flat, final. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. He studied her for a moment, weighing options. The Christian thing would be to offer help, but he'd learned that city women often took offense at such offers from strange men. even when they were meant honest. Still, leaving her here sat wrong with him, like a splinter under the skin. "There's a lean-to about 3 miles out. At my place," he said finally, keeping his voice neutral as discussing the weather. "It's dry. Got fresh straw. You're welcome to bed down there if you've got no other plans. Horses won't bother you none." She blinked, surprise flickering across her face before suspicion replaced it. That is, I couldn't impose." "No imposition. I'll be in the house. You'll be in the barn, just offering shelter from the storm. Nothing more." He turned back toward his wagon, then paused. "Name's Matthew Colton. I run horses out at the Triple C. Folk in town know me, if you want to ask around first." "I don't have money for lodging," she said quietly. "Didn't ask for any." He climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. "If you're coming, best decide quick. Ground's getting worse by the minute." She stood there for a long moment, rain running down her face, visibly wrestling with the decision. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of risks, the measure of desperation against propriety. He'd seen that look before, in horses that had been handled rough. Trust came hard when the world had knocked you around some. Finally, she bent to retrieve her carpet bag and a small trunk he hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind her skirts. "I accept your offer, Mr. Colton, and I thank you for it." He climbed down again to help her with the trunk, lifting it easily into the wagon bed. It weighed almost nothing. Whatever life she'd packed into it didn't amount to much. She climbed up onto the seat beside him, careful to keep proper distance between them despite the narrow bench. "The horses are Buck and Bell," he said as he guided them back onto the street. "They're good animals. Steady." She nodded, but didn't respond, her hands folded tight in her lap. He didn't try to make more conversation. The rain would have made it difficult anyway, drumming on the wagon's canvas cover and turning the road to soup. The 3-mile journey took nearly an hour, the horses picking their way careful through the mud. Once, the wagon lurched hard to the left as a wheel caught in a hidden rut, and she gasped, grabbing the seat's edge. But she didn't cry out or complain, just steadied herself and continued staring straight ahead into the darkness. The Triple C Ranch wasn't much to look at, especially in the rain. A simple 2-story frame house, painted white some years back but weathering to gray. A barn that stood solid if not pretty, built to withstand prairie winds. Various outbuildings scattered about smokehouse, chicken coop, the lean-to he'd mentioned attached to the barn's south side. Matthew pulled the wagon up to the barn doors and climbed down to open them. The familiar smell of hay and horses and leather greeted him, along with curious nickering from the stalls within. He led Buck and Bell inside, then turned to help his unexpected guest down. "Lean-tos through here," he said, leading her past the stalls to a door in the barn's side wall. The space beyond was simple but clean. He'd used it for a hired hand 2 seasons back. A cot with a straw tick mattress, a small table, a chair, pegs on the wall for hanging things, a window that actually had glass in it, even if it was cracked in one corner. "There's fresh straw in the corner there if the tick needs filling," he said. "Water barrels just outside, and the privy's behind the house. I'll bring out some blankets once I get the horses settled." She set down her carpet bag and looked around the small space. This is very kind of you." "It's dry," he said simply. "That's what matters on a night like this." He left her there and tended to the horses, rubbing them down and giving them their grain. By the time he returned with an armload of blankets and an old oil lamp, she'd taken off her soaked bonnet and was trying to wring water from her skirts. "These are clean," he said, setting the blankets on the cot. "Lamp's got oil in it. There's matches on the table." He paused at the door. "I'll bring some food out once I get something heated up." "Please don't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble. Coffee and stew, nothing fancy." He studied her for a moment. "What's your name? Seems only fair, since you know mine." She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Joanna Hart, Miss Joanna Hart." "Welcome to the Triple C, Miss Hart. such as it is. He touched his hat brim again and stepped back out into the rain, closing the door firm behind him. Walking back to the house, Matthew wondered what kind of trouble he'd just invited onto his property. A woman alone, traveling in weather like this, with barely enough possessions to fill a small trunk. There was a story there, and probably not a happy one. But he'd made the offer, and she'd accepted, and that was that. Tomorrow could sort out the complications. Tonight, she needed shelter, and he had it to give. Besides, the barn had felt too empty lately anyway. Even if it was just for one night, it would be good to have it useful again. To know someone was finding comfort in a space he'd built with his own hands. Margaret would have approved, he thought, then pushed the thought away before it could take root and flower into grief. The rain continued to fall, but gentler now, as if the storm had worn out its fury. In the barn, a lamp flickered to life, casting warm light through the cracks in the lean-to door. Matthew allowed himself one last glance before heading inside to heat up the promised stew. Joanna woke to the sound of horses breathing. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where were the street sounds of Philadelphia? The creak of her aunt's house settling in the night. Then memory flooded back the failed journey, the abandoned depot, the taciturn rancher who'd offered shelter without questions or judgment. Pale morning light filtered through the cracked window, revealing dust motes dancing in the air. The storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar freshness that follows rain in dry country. She could smell hay and leather and the earthy scent of animals not unpleasant, just different from anything she'd known. Her dress had dried stiff and wrinkled overnight. Despite her attempts to smooth it before sleeping, she did what she could with her appearance, using precious water from her canteen to wash her face and hands, rebraiding her hair into something resembling respectability. The small mirror in her carpet bag showed a face she barely recognized, thinner than before. Shadows under her eyes. But something else too, a hardness beginning to form, like calluses on a working hand. The barn proper was quiet when she emerged from the lean-to. 4 horses occupied the stalls, the 2 from last night and 2 others, a gray mare and a painted gelding. They turned to watch her with liquid brown eyes, curious but calm. Through the open barn doors, she could see the ranch spread out in morning light, the white house weathering to gray, a vegetable garden struggling against prairie winds, fence lines stretching toward distant horizons. On a wooden crate near the door sat a bowl covered with a clean cloth. Underneath, she found porridge still warm, with a dollop of molasses and a spoon stuck in it. No note, no fanfare, just breakfast left where she'd find it. The simple kindness of it made her throat tight. She ate standing in the doorway, watching the ranch come alive. Chickens pecked in the yard, and somewhere a rooster crowed his authority. Mr. Colton was already at work. She could see him out by one of the corrals, mending what looked like storm damage to a fence. He moved with the easy efficiency of a man who knew his work well, never hurrying but never wasting motion either. The porridge was good, better than she'd expected from a man living alone. It filled the hollow space in her stomach and gave her strength to face what came next. She couldn't stay here, that much was clear. Last night's shelter had been emergency charity, but daylight brought the need for decisions. She washed the bowl at the water barrel, dried it carefully with her handkerchief, and walked toward where Mr. Colton worked. He straightened as she approached, pulling off worn leather gloves to wipe his forehead. "Morning, Miss Hart. Sleep all right?" "Yes, thank you. The accommodations were more than adequate." She held out the bowl. "And thank you for breakfast." He took it, setting it aside on a fence post. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some. Help yourself." "Mr. Colton, I need to discuss arrangements. I can't pay for lodging, as I mentioned, but I'm willing to work. I can cook, clean, mend." "Already got someone comes in twice a week for that," he interrupted, but not unkindly. "Mrs. Holbrook from the neighboring spread. Disappointment settled heavy in her chest. Of course he did. A man with a ranch this size wouldn't lack for help. I see. Then I should. Can you handle horses? The question caught her off guard. What? Horses. Can you work with them? Feed, groom, exercise. He nodded toward the barn. My hand lit out 2 days ago. Decided California Gold sounded better than Kansas horses. Been managing alone, but it's more work than one person can properly handle. I've never worked with horses, she admitted. In Philadelphia? You're not in Philadelphia now. His tone was matter-of-fact, not cruel. But you didn't flinch when Belle snorted last night, and you kept your seat when the wagon hit that rut. That's more than some folks manage. She considered it. The horses seemed calm enough, large but not frightening. And what choice did she have? Really, I can learn. I'm not afraid of hard work. Pays $15 a month plus board. The lean-to's yours if you want it. Sunday's off, and you can take meals in the kitchen. I'm not much for conversation, so if you're looking for society, you'll need to find it in town. $15. It wasn't much, but with board included, she could save most of it, maybe enough to eventually get back east, or at least somewhere more civilized than Dustwell. When would you need to know? Now's good. That hay won't fork itself, and Belle's got a stone bruise needs tending. She thought of the alternatives, the seedy boarding house, the saloon she'd heard last night, the uncertainty of finding other work in a town that had already shown its cold shoulder. Then she looked at the barn, solid and well kept, and the horses that watched the world with calm eyes. I accept your offer, Mr. Colton. He nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer, and pulled his gloves back on. Come on, then. Might as well start learning. The next hours passed in a blur of new information. This was Belle, who liked her ears scratched but would cow-kick if you surprised her. That was Buck, steady as stone but prone to stealing hats. The gray mare was Silver, getting on in years but still sound. The paint was Patch, young and full of opinions about everything. Matthew showed her how to measure grain, how to check water buckets, how to hold a hoof pick. His hands were patient as he demonstrated, his voice steady as he explained. He smelled of leather and soap and something else, the indefinable scent of a man who worked with his hands and slept sound at night. You don't hold the hoof like you're afraid it'll break, he said, guiding her hands. Firm, but not harsh. Horses need to know you're sure of yourself, even when you're not. The work was harder than she'd anticipated. By noon, her back ached from forking hay, and her hands bore the beginning of blisters despite the gloves Matthew had found for her. But there was something satisfying about it, too. The horses' obvious contentment when she brought their feed, the way Silver leaned into the brush when she groomed her, the small nod of approval Matthew gave when she successfully picked Belle's hooves without help. They ate lunch in the kitchen, cold beef, bread, early apples from a tree behind the house. The room was clean but spare, with minimal decoration save for a sampler on the wall that read, "Bless this home," in careful cross-stitch. Joanna wondered if the late Mrs. Colton had made it, but didn't ask. You did all right this morning, Matthew said, cutting another slice of bread. Horses seem to take to you. They're more forgiving than people, she found herself saying, then flushed at the personal revelation. That's true enough. He studied her for a moment. You running from something? Miss Hartlaw trouble? No, nothing like that. She met his eyes directly. Just a fool's errand that didn't pan out. Poor judgment, not criminal activity. Fair enough. We've all made those. He pushed back from the table. There's mending in that basket by the doorwork shirts, mostly. If you're handy with a needle, I'd appreciate it. Meant to ask Mrs. Holbrook, but it slipped my mind. The afternoon passed quietly, while Matthew worked outside. Joanna sat on the lean-to's small porch and mended tears in worn cotton shirts. The repetitive motion soothed her, familiar after years of needlework in her aunt's house. But this was different somehow. These shirts smelled of honest work, not pomade and cigars. The tears came from labor, not carelessness. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rose, Joanna felt something she hadn't expected, a measure of peace. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't even a life she'd have chosen, but it was honest work for honest pay, a clean place to sleep, and a man who asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer. She finished the last shirt as Matthew came in from the evening feeding. He examined her work with the same careful attention he'd given to checking the horse's hooves, then nodded approval. "That'll do fine. Saved me buying new." He hung the shirts on pegs by the door. "Same time tomorrow morning, then I generally start at dawn." "I'll be ready." She walked back to the lean-to as stars began to prick the darkening sky. Behind her, lamplight bloomed in the house windows, warm and golden. Ahead, the barn loomed solid and reassuring, full of the quiet sounds of horses settling for the night. It wasn't the future she'd dreamed of on those long nights in Philadelphia, writing letters to a man who'd proved false, but it was a future she could see one day at a time, one chore at a time, building something steady on the firm foundation of work and quiet dignity. Tomorrow there would be more hay to fork, more horses to tend, more shirts to mend, and somehow that felt like enough. The first week passed in a rhythm of work that left Joanna too tired to dwell on her circumstances. By the second week, her hands had hardened, her back had strengthened, and she'd learned to read the horses' moods by the set of their ears and the swish of their tails. She rose before dawn, worked through the day, and fell asleep to the sound of owls calling across the prairie. Matthew Colton proved to be exactly what he'd promised, a fair employer who kept his distance. He paid her for 2 weeks' work on the appointed day, counting out the coins with the same careful precision he applied to measuring grain. He answered her questions about the work readily enough, but offered nothing personal, and she matched his reserve with her own. It was the third week when she noticed things that needed doing beyond her assigned duties. The garden gate hung crooked on its hinges. The chicken coop had gaps that let in drafts. Harness leather cracked for want of oiling. Small things, but they nagged at her sense of order. She started with the leather, working oil into the dry straps during the quiet afternoon hour when the horses dozed in their stalls. Matthew found her at it, his eyebrows rising slightly. "That's not part of your duties," he observed. "The horses deserve sound tack," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Weak leather is dangerous." He watched her for a moment longer, then walked away without comment. But the next day, she found a better tin of leather oil on the workbench, along with clean rags for the purpose. The garden gate she fixed herself, tightening the hinges with tools she found in the barn. The chicken coop required more skill than she possessed, but she mentioned it to Matthew one morning, casual-like. "Foxes'll get in through those gaps come winter," she said, scattering grain for the hens. "I know," he replied. "Been meaning to get to it." "I could help, if you showed me what to do." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. "You always this eager for extra work?" "I don't like seeing things that need doing go undone," she said simply. "My father was a clockmaker. He taught me that small problems become big ones if you ignore them." That afternoon, he showed her how to cut and fit boards to patch the coop. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she persisted. And by evening, the gaps were sealed tight. The chickens seemed to approve, settling onto their roosts with contented clucks. As autumn deepened, she found herself taking on more such tasks. She organized the tack room, mended bridles, helped Matthew repair storm damage to the barn roof. He never asked her to do these things, but he stopped protesting when she did them. Sometimes she caught him watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read: surprise, maybe, or something close to approval. The house remained off limits, an unspoken boundary she didn't cross. Mrs. Holbrook came twice a week as promised. A sturdy woman of 50 who eyed Joanna with frank suspicion but kept her thoughts to herself. Joanna ate her meals in the kitchen when invited, but retreated to the barn afterward, maintaining the careful distance that kept their arrangement respectable. One evening, as she was settling silver for the night, Matthew appeared in the barn doorway. He rarely sought her out after dark, and she tensed, wondering if something was wrong. "There's coffee on," he said. "Thought you might want some before it gets cold." She followed him to the kitchen, where 2 cups waited on the table. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around them. Outside, wind rattled the windows, promising another storm. "You've been here a month now," he said finally. "Still planning to save up and head back east?" The question caught her unprepared. In those first days, getting back to Philadelphia had been her only thought. But lately, "I haven't decided," she admitted. "There's not much waiting for me there." "Family?" "An aunt who made it clear I'd burned my bridges when I left." She turned her cup in her hands, watching the coffee swirl. "You must think me foolish, traveling all this way on a stranger's promises." "I think you're someone who took a chance that didn't work out," he said quietly. "Nothing foolish about hope, even when it disappoints." She looked at him then, seeing new lines around his eyes, silver threading through his dark hair. 3 years a widower, the town gossips had told her. 3 years managing alone. "Were you happy before?" He knew what she meant. "Margaret and I had 12 good years." "Not everyone gets that much." He stood, ending the conversation before it could go deeper. "Storm's coming. Better check the barn doors are secure." But as she walked back through the wind, Joanna thought about those 12 years, about a house that still held cross-stitched samplers and woman's touches despite 3 years of absence. She thought about her own plans, built on 2 months of letters and pretty lies, crumbling at first contact with reality. Some people got 12 years, some got 12 weeks of delusion. The lucky ones, perhaps, got a chance to build something new from the wreckage. The next morning brought not a storm, but a visitor. Joanna was mucking stalls when she heard voices from the yard, Matthew's low rumble and another man's heartier tones. She didn't think much of it until Matthew appeared in the barn doorway. "Miss Hart, could you come out here a moment?" The visitor was a man of middle years, well-dressed in town clothes, with the soft look of someone who worked with papers rather than horses. He studied Joanna with sharp eyes that missed nothing her men's work clothes, her calloused hands, the ease with which she stood in the barn doorway like she belonged there. "This is Mr. Foster from the bank," Matthew said. "He's got some questions about the arrangement here." "Miss Hart, is it?" Foster's smile was thin as winter sunshine. "I understand you're residing on Mr. Colton's property." "I'm employed here, yes, as a ranch hand." She kept her voice level, though something in the man's manner made her wary. "Unusual occupation for a lady." His tone suggested it wasn't the word unusual he wanted to use. "And you live in the barn?" "In the lean-to. It's separate from the main barn and quite proper." "I'm sure you believe so." Foster turned to Matthew. "Mr. Colton, you must understand the bank's position. We hold the mortgage on this property. We have a certain interest in maintaining the respectability of our investments." Matthew's expression didn't change, but Joanna saw his hands tighten slightly. "My loan payments are current. Foster, have been for 8 years. Of course. But there's the matter of the community standards. A unmarried woman, living here without proper supervision. People talk, you understand." "People always talk," Matthew said flatly. "Doesn't make their talk worth listening to." Foster's smile grew even thinner. "Perhaps not, but talk can affect property values, business relationships. I'm sure you wouldn't want any complications with your loan terms." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Joanna felt anger rise in her throat, hot and bitter. She'd done nothing but work hard and live quietly, and still respectability reached out to slap her down. "Mr. Foster," she said, stepping forward. "I appreciate your concern for community standards. Perhaps you'd be reassured to know that I attend church services when my duties permit. That, Mrs. Holbrook can attest to the propriety of the arrangements here, and that my employment is entirely professional. Unless, of course, you object to women working for their living." Foster's face reddened. "I merely suggest that there are more suitable arrangements for a lady seeking employment in town. Perhaps. The boarding house is always looking for help." "The boarding house where the owner charges female employees half their wages for a shared room." Joanna kept her voice pleasant. "How charitable of you to suggest it." "Miss Hart's employment here is my business," Matthew interjected. "If the bank has concerns about my loan, address them to me directly. Otherwise, I've got work to do." Foster left with vague warnings about community opinion and the bank's responsibility to its depositors. After his buggy disappeared down the road, Matthew stood silent for a long moment, looking toward town. "He'll make trouble," Joanna said quietly. "Let him try." Matthew's voice was grim. "I've never missed a payment, never asked for extensions. They've got no cause to call in the loan early. But they could make things difficult." "Maybe." He turned to look at her. "This isn't your problem to solve. I hired you to work with horses, not fight my battles with the bank. I don't want to be the reason you lose." "You're not." His tone brooked no argument. "Now, don't we have stalls to finish?" They worked in silence the rest of the morning, but Joanna's mind churned. She'd fled Philadelphia to escape one trap only to create another. Her presence here threatened Matthew's ranch, his reputation, his livelihood. The right thing would be to leave before more damage was done. But as she watched him work steady, methodical, treating this new problem like he'd treat a fence that needed mending or a horse that needed gentling, she found herself reluctant to run again. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was selfish. But she'd found something here she hadn't expected: work that mattered, animals that depended on her, and a man who judged her by her actions rather than society's expectations. That evening, as she cleaned Silver's hooves, Joanna made a decision. "I'm not leaving because of Foster," she announced to the mayor. "Not unless Mr. Colton asks me to. I've run from enough things in my life." Silver snorted and stamped, which Joanna chose to take as approval. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought: more gossip, more pressure, more threats veiled in polite language. But tonight, she had stalls to bed down, horses to feed, and honest work to finish. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but increasingly, it felt like the life she'd chosen, and that, perhaps, made all the difference. The whispers started at Thornton's general store. Joanna had gone to town for supplies, a list from Matthew tucked in her pocket salt. Coffee, liniment for Buck's shoulder. She'd grown comfortable with these errands over the past 6 weeks, nodding politely to the townspeople who'd begun to accept her presence, if not embrace it. But today felt different. Conversations halted when she entered. Mrs. Thornton, usually cordial enough, barely met her eyes as she filled the order. 2 women by the fabric counter: Mrs. Foster, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Bennett, married to the minister, made no effort to lower their voices. Living in sin, bold as brass. Mrs. Foster was saying, "My herald says she was found sleeping in the train depot like some vagrant. And now she's ensconced on the Colton ranch, doing heaven knows what." Mrs. Bennett clutched her reticule tighter. That poor man, still grieving his dear Margaret, taken advantage of by some Eastern Jezebel. Joanna kept her back straight as she counted out coins for Mrs. Thornton. Her hands didn't shake. She was proud of that, but heat climbed her neck. She'd faced worse in Philadelphia when news of her ruined engagement had spread through her aunt's social circle. But somehow, this cut deeper. She'd worked so hard here, tried to build something respectable through honest labor. "That'll be $2.30, Mrs. Thornton said quietly, still not meeting Joanna's eyes. As Joanna reached for the door, packages in hand, "Mrs." Foster's voice followed her. "Mark my words, no good will come of it. A widow man and an unmarried woman under the same roof, it's an abomination." "We don't live under the same roof," Joanna said, turning back. Both women startled, as if they'd forgotten she could speak. "I live in the barn lean-to and work as a ranch hand. Mr. Colton has been nothing but proper and professional." "Mrs." Foster's face flushed ugly red. "A woman doing man's work, living like an animal in a barn, you call that proper? You're a disgrace to your sex." "I call it earning an honest living," Joanna replied evenly, which is more than can be said for spreading malicious gossip. She left before they could respond, but their shocked gasps followed her onto the street. Her packages felt heavier now, weighted with the town's judgment. She passed the millinery shop where she'd once thought to seek employment, the boarding house with its predatory owner, the church where she'd attended exactly twice before feeling the weight of too many stares. At the livery stable, she loaded her purchases onto the wagon Matthew had let her borrow. Old Sam, the hostler, helped her with the heavier sacks, his weathered face kind. "Don't let them hens ruffle your feathers, miss," he said quietly. "Some folks got nothing better to do than peck at others." "Thank you, Sam," she managed to smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm afraid the hens are quite determined to peck." "Hey, well," he spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Matthew Colton's a good man. Stood by me when my boy got in trouble last year. Gave him work when nobody else would. He sees something worthwhile in you. That's good enough for folks that matter." But as Joanna drove back to the Triple C, she wondered how many folks would agree with Sam's assessment, and more importantly, how long before the pecking hens made life unbearable, not just for her, but for Matthew. She found him in the south pasture, working with a young colt he'd been training. The horse was skittish, fighting the lead rope. But Matthew remained patient, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced up as she pulled in, but didn't acknowledge her beyond a brief nod. Focused on the colt, Joanna unloaded the supplies, storing everything in its proper place. The familiar routine of the ranch settled her nerves somewhat. Here, at least, she knew her worth. The horses didn't care about propriety or her unmarried state. They cared that she fed them on time, kept their water fresh, and handled them with steady hands. She was measuring grain for the evening feeding when Matthew appeared in the barn doorway. "Heard you had some trouble in town." News traveled fast on the prairie. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "Sam says you gave Mrs. Foster a piece of your mind." "She had it coming." Joanna didn't look up from her work. "Though I suppose I should have kept quiet. It'll only make things worse." Matthew was silent for a moment. Then, Margaret never could stand Constance Foster. Said she was a bitter woman who'd soured on life and wanted everyone else to be miserable too. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his wife beyond the barest acknowledgement. Joanna stilled, afraid to break the moment. "Course, Margaret had a way of seeing the best in folks," he continued. "Even the ones who probably didn't deserve it. But she drew the line at deliberate meanness. She sounds like she was a good woman." She was. Simple, declarative. But Joanna heard the weight of loss in those two words. "She'd have liked you, I think. Appreciated someone who wasn't afraid of hard work." They stood in comfortable silence. The barn's familiar sounds around them, horses shifting in their stalls, barn cats hunting mice in the loft, wind sighing through the gaps in the walls. Finally, Matthew cleared his throat. "About the talk in town. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Foster's been spreading his poison, and folks listen to the banker. You should know that before you decide to stay on." "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." The word came quick and firm. "I'm saying you should know what you're facing. This isn't Philadelphia. Small towns got long memories and sharp tongues." "I've noticed." She finally looked at him, seeing concern in his dark eyes. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. "Mr. Colton, if my presence here is causing you difficulty..." My difficulties started long before you arrived. Miss Hart, the bank's been looking for an excuse to pressure me since Margaret died. Foster's got his eye on this land for his brother-in-law's cattle operation. You're just convenient ammunition. All the more reason I should go. Remove the ammunition. And then what? You go back to sleeping in train depots, take a job at the boarding house where Patterson charges the girls half their wages for a moldy mattress and wandering hands. His voice hardened. You think I'd sleep sound knowing I'd sent you to that? The unexpected protectiveness in his tone made her throat tight. I've taken care of myself before. I don't doubt it, but there's no need when you've got honest work here. He moved past her to check Buck's water. Besides, Silver's gotten attached to you. Be cruel to separate them now. Despite everything, Joanna felt her lips twitch. Silver's attached to anyone who brings apples. Well, there's that. He almost smiled. She could see it in the corners of his eyes. Point is, you've got a job here as long as you want it. Let the town hens cluck. But the clucking grew louder over the following days. On Sunday, when Joanna attempted to attend church, she found her usual pew mysteriously full. Other pews had space, but parishioners spread out their belongings, avoiding her eyes. Only the back bench, reserved for traveling salesmen and known drunks, had room. Reverend Bennett preached on the sins of Jezebel, his eyes finding hers repeatedly through the sermon. The message wasn't subtle. The foreign woman who led good men astray, who upset the natural order, who brought destruction in her wake. Joanna sat through it all, spine straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. After the service, as she tried to leave quietly, a hand fell on her arm. Mrs. Holbrook, Matthew's twice-weekly housekeeper, stood beside her. "Walk with me," the older woman said, loud enough for others to hear. It wasn't a request. They made their way through the churchyard, past the shocked faces of the congregation. Mrs. Holbrook's grip on Joanna's arm was firm but not unkind. "I've worked for Matthew Colton for 3 years. Mrs. Holbrook said conversationally. "Since just after Margaret passed, I know that house, that ranch, that man's character better than any gossip in town." She paused at the gate, turning to face the watching crowd. "And I'll tell anyone who asks that there's nothing improper happening at the Triple C. The girl works hard, keeps to herself, and maintains perfect propriety. Anyone saying different is bearing false witness." The words carried across the churchyard. Some folks had the grace to look ashamed. Others, like Mrs. Foster, simply sniffed and turned away. But a few Sam from the livery. The widow Martinez, who ran the boarding house for travelers. Young Tom Bradley from the next ranch over nodded approval. "Thank you," Joanna said quietly as they walked toward the wagons. "Don't thank me. I'm just speaking truth." Mrs. Holbrook's sharp eyes studied her. "You're good for that ranch. First time in 3 years I've seen Matthew take an interest in something beyond bare survival. That's worth more than the opinion of dried-up biddies with nothing better to do than spread poison. But the talk will die down when they find something new to fuss about. Always does." The older woman climbed onto her buggy with surprising agility. "You just keep doing what you're doing, girl. Let Matthew handle his own battles. Man's been fighting longer than you know." That evening, Joanna found a package on her doorstep. Mrs. Holbrook's famous apple preserves, wrapped in brown paper with a note. "For your breakfast. Strong women need good food." It was the first kindness from the town in weeks, and Joanna clutched it like a treasure. As she prepared for bed in her little lean-to, she thought about the day's events. The town's judgment stung, but not as much as she'd expected. Somewhere between Philadelphia's drawing rooms and this Kansas barn, she'd developed thicker skin. Or maybe it was that here. She had something worth fighting for, work that mattered, animals that depended on her, and a quiet man who defended her right to stay without making her feel beholden. Tomorrow there would be more whispers, more cold shoulders, more sermons aimed at her unworthiness. But there would also be Silver's gentle eyes, Buck's improving shoulder, the satisfaction of a hard day's work well done, and maybe, if she was lucky, another almost smile from Matthew Colton, worth more than all the approval in Dustwell. The autumn wind picked up, rattling the lean-to's window, but inside, Joanna was warm and dry, with a full stomach and a clear conscience. Let the hens cluck, she thought, echoing Matthew's words. She had better things to do than listen. The first time Joanna heard him call out in his sleep, she'd been sitting by the barn door, mending a bridle by lamplight. The sound carried across the yard from the house not a scream, but something worse. A broken voice calling a name. "Margaret! Margaret! No!" She froze, needle suspended in midair. The cries continued for several minutes before fading into silence. Part of her wanted to go to him, but she knew better. Whatever demons Matthew Colton fought in his dreams were his to battle. She was his hired hand, nothing more. But it happened again the next night, and the next, always around midnight, always the same desperate calling. By the fourth night, Joanna couldn't stand it. She made her way across the yard, her boots crunching on frost-brittle grass, and knocked softly on the kitchen door. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Mr. Colton Matthew." The door opened suddenly. He stood there in his nightshirt and trousers, hair wild, eyes unfocused. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cold October night. "Miss Hart," he blinked, seeming to come back to himself. "Is something wrong, the horses?" "The horses are fine." She hesitated on the threshold. "I heard, that is, you seemed distressed. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Embarrassment flickered across his features. "I apologize if I disturbed you. Sometimes I—" He stopped, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's nothing. Please, go back to bed." But Joanna had seen that look before, in her father's eyes after her mother died, the haunted expression of someone reliving loss over and over in dreams. "Would coffee help? I know where Mrs. Holbrook keeps the pot." He should have refused. Propriety demanded it. An unmarried woman in his kitchen at midnight was exactly the fodder the gossips craved. But something in her steady gaze, the matter-of-fact offer of help without pity, made him step aside. Coffee would be appreciated. She moved efficiently around the kitchen, stoking the banked fire, filling the pot. He sat at the table, hands clasped, looking lost in his own home. Neither spoke until she set a cup before him, then poured one for herself. 3 years, he said suddenly. You'd think it would get easier. It doesn't. She kept her voice gentle. It changes, but it doesn't get easier, just different. He looked at her sharply. You lost someone. My parents, not the same as a spouse, I know, but... She shrugged. The dreams were the worst part, seeing them healthy and whole, then waking to remember they're gone. Yes, the word came out raw. In my dreams, I can save her. There's time to get the doctor. The fever breaks. She lives. Then I wake up and... He stopped, jaw clenching. Tell me about her. Joanna said softly. Not the end. Tell me about when she was well. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse or order her out. Then, slowly, he began to speak. She loved to sing. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but that never stopped her. She'd sing while she cooked, while she gardened, drove the chickens crazy. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She named all the horses after characters from books she'd read, insisted they had personalities that matched. Buck was Bucephalus, after Alexander's horse. Silver was Shadowfax. Though that book wasn't even written yet, she just liked the sound. She was educated then. Her father was a schoolmaster back in Ohio. She could quote Shakespeare and milk a cow with equal skill. The smile grew slightly. First time I saw her, she was arguing with Thomas Morrison at the general store about women's suffrage. Poor Thomas didn't know what hit him. Morrison. Any relation to Charles Morrison? Matthew's expression darkened. His younger brother. Why? Joanna felt heat climb her neck. No reason. Tell me more about Margaret. But his eyes had sharpened. Charles Morrison was the one who wrote to you. The one who didn't show. It wasn't a question. Joanna stared into her coffee cup. It doesn't matter now. The hell it doesn't. The vehemence in his voice startled her. Charles Morrison is a confidence man, and worse. He's done this before, writing to lonely women back east, making promises, getting them to come out here. Then he disappears, and they're left with nothing. What happens to them? She already knew the answer, but needed to hear it. Some take work at the saloon. Some marry the first man who'll have them, regardless of character. Some... He didn't finish. I should have warned you that first night, but I figured you'd had enough troubles without me adding to them. It wouldn't have changed anything. I had nowhere else to go. She met his eyes. I'm glad I ended up here instead. Something shifted in his expression, a softening she'd rarely seen. Margaret would have horsewhipped Charles Morrison if she'd known. She had strong opinions about men who preyed on women's hopes. She sounds wonderful. She was. He stared into his coffee. She was also stubborn as a mule. Couldn't cook worth a damn despite all that singing. And once made me sleep in the barn for a week because I sold her favorite laying hen by mistake. Joanna found herself smiling. How long before she forgave you? Who says she forgave me? I had to buy 3 new hens and name them all after her favorite Shakespeare heroines before she'd let me back in the house. His voice had lost some of its raw edge. Even then, she made me promise to consult her before any future livestock decisions. They sat in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm around them. The clock on the mantel chimed 1, and Joanna started to rise. I should go. If anyone saw... Wait. He stood as well, seeming to wrestle with something. Thank you for the coffee and the listening. It helps. Talking about her when she was alive instead of how she died. Joanna understood. Mr. Colton Matthew, she's not really gone. Not as long as you remember the singing and the Shakespeare and the chickens. That's the part that stays. He walked her to the door, grabbing a lantern from its hook. I'll walk you back. It's only across the yard. Nevertheless. They crossed the frozen ground in silence, their breath clouding in the cold air. At the lean-to door, he handed her the lantern. Miss Hart Joanna. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer. I'm glad you're here, not just for the work, I'm glad. Before she could respond, he was walking back to the house, a tall shadow against the starlit sky. Joanna stood in her doorway, holding the lantern, watching until he disappeared inside. Something had changed tonight. Some invisible line crossed. Not impropriety, nothing the gossips could point to, but a shift from employer and employee to something harder to define. Inside her small room, she found sleep elusive, not from Matthew's cries this time, but from the memory of his voice saying her name, the glimpse of the man he'd been before grief rewrote his world. She thought about Margaret, singing off-key while naming horses after storybook heroes, arguing about suffrage in the general store, a woman who'd been loved completely and mourned just as deeply. Joanna had come west chasing an illusion, a false promise from a practiced liar, but maybe that disappointment had led her exactly where she needed to be, to a ranch where broken things could heal, where work had meaning, where a grieving man was slowly remembering how to smile when talking about his dead wife's quarrels with chickens. The next morning, she found a cup of coffee waiting on the fence post by the barn, still steaming in the cold air. No note, no acknowledgement, just coffee fixed the way she liked it. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled. That night, there were no cries from the house, whether Matthew slept peacefully or simply more quietly. Joanna didn't know, but she liked to think that talking about Margaret living instead of Margaret dying had given him sweeter dreams, at least for one night. In the days that followed, They fell back into their usual routine work and meals and careful distance. But sometimes she'd catch him almost smiling at one of the horses. Or he'd mention something Margaret used to say, and the kitchen night stood between them like a bridge built but not yet crossed. The town could gossip all it wanted. What they'd shared had been more intimate than anything the scandal-mongers imagined. And yet, as innocent as coffee between two people who understood that grief was just love with nowhere to go. And perhaps, Joanna thought as she watched him work with quiet competence, that was the beginning of something. Not replacement, never that, but something new growing in soil, enriched by loss, and tended with patient hands. The harvest festival arrived with the first real cold snap of autumn, turning the prairie grass golden and sending geese honking southward in great V formations. Dust well transformed for the occasion, bunting strung between buildings. Tables set up in the church square, the smell of baking pies and roasting meat drawing folks from miles around. Joanna hadn't planned to attend. The memory of cold shoulders at church services still stung, and she had no desire to spend her Sunday off being whispered about. But Mrs. Holbrook appeared at the barn Saturday evening with unexpected determination. "You'll need something proper to wear," the older woman announced, holding up a burgundy dress. "This was my daughter's before she married and moved to California. Should fit you well enough." "Mrs. Holbrook, I appreciate the thought, but—" "No buts. You've been hiding out here for 2 months, letting those harpies think they've won. Time to show your face and remind them you're not going anywhere." "I have nothing to prove to them." "Not to them, no." Mrs. Holbrook laid the dress across a hay bale, smoothing its skirts. "But Matthew's planning to go. First time since Margaret passed. Be a shame if he had to go alone." Joanna stilled. "He didn't mention—" "Man doesn't mention much of anything. But I heard him tell Tom Bradley he'd enter Buck in the horse race. And yesterday he asked if I knew whether you had anything suitable for town." The housekeeper's eyes were knowing. "Draw your own conclusions." After Mrs. Holbrook left, Joanna held up the dress. It was finer than anything she'd worn since leaving Philadelphia. Wool crepe with jet buttons, a fitted bodice, and skirts that would rustle when she walked. Respectable, but not ostentatious. She tried to tell herself the flutter in her stomach was just nerves about facing the town. Nothing to do with Matthew seeing her in something other than work clothes. Sunday dawned crisp and bright. The sky that particular shade of blue that only came with autumn on the prairie. Joanna dressed carefully, pinning her hair in a style she hadn't attempted in months. The face in her small mirror looked different. Sun-browned, thinner, but somehow more alive than the pale girl who'd fled Philadelphia. She emerged from the lean-to to find Matthew already hitching the wagon. Buck tied to the back. He turned at her approach and stopped mid-motion, his hands still on the harness. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the barnyard. "You look—" he cleared his throat. "That color suits you." "Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook insisted." She smoothed her skirts nervously. "Are you certain this is wise? My presence might—" "Make things uncomfortable." He finished harnessing the team with quick efficiency. "Good. Town's been too comfortable with their gossip. Time they remembered how to be civil to a neighbor." The ride to town passed largely in silence, but it was companionable rather than awkward. Joanna found herself stealing glances at Matthew, who'd traded his usual work clothes for a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He'd trimmed his beard and his dark hair was neatly combed, though a stubborn piece insisted on falling across his forehead. The church square buzzed with activity. Children ran between the booths while their mothers called warnings. Men gathered around the livestock pens arguing about horseflesh and crop prices, and the ladies' auxiliary presided over tables groaning with food. The moment Matthew helped Joanna down from the wagon, conversations faltered. "Steady," he murmured, offering his arm. "Just neighbors at a harvest festival. Nothing scandalous about that." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the wool. Together they walked into the crowd, heads high, ignoring the whispers that followed in their wake. Some folks nodded, greeting Sam from the livery. The widow Martinez, Tom Bradley, and his wife. Others turned away, but Matthew seemed not to notice, steering her toward the registration table for the horse race. Matthew Colton Judge Harper, serving as race official, beamed at them. "Haven't seen you at one of these in years. That buck you're entering?" "Yes, sir. Figure it's time he earned his keep." Matthew signed the entry form with steady hands. "You remember Miss Hart. She's been working with Buck these past months. He's in fine condition thanks to her care." The judge's eyes flickered between them, but his smile remained warm. "Miss Hart, heard you've got away with horses. My wife mentioned seeing Silver looking better than she has in years." "Thank you, sir. Silver just needed some extra attention." Joanna kept her voice level, though the unexpected kindness made her throat tight. They made their way through the festival, Matthew introducing her to neighbors she'd only seen from a distance. Not everyone was welcoming Mrs. Foster made a show of gathering her skirts and moving away when they passed, but more people than Joanna expected offered polite conversation. She began to understand what Matthew had done by appearing with her publicly, treating her as a respected member of his household rather than hiding her away. He'd forced the town to make a choice, snub them both, or accept the situation. At the pie contest booth, they found an unexpected ally, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, Thomas Morrison's wife and Charles's sister-in-law, approached with determination in her step. "Miss Hart," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "I owe you an apology. My brother-in-law's behavior was inexcusable. I've written to the authorities in Kansas City about his activities. No woman should suffer because of his deceptions." Joanna felt Matthew tense beside her, but she pressed his arm gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. That's very kind of you to say." "Kind nothing. It's only right." The woman's chin lifted. "My husband and I would be pleased if you'd both join us for supper after church next Sunday, if you're amenable. That is—" The invitation was more than social nicety. It was a public declaration of support from one of the town's established families. Joanna glanced at Matthew, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "We'd be honored," Joanna replied. As Mrs. Morrison walked away, Matthew guided Joanna toward a quieter corner of the square. "You handled that well." "I've had practice with difficult social situations." She watched children bobbing for apples, their shrieks of laughter carrying on the wind. "This is nothing compared to Philadelphia society matrons." "Is that why you left the society matrons?" She considered how much to reveal. "Partly. My aunt had very specific ideas about my future. Marriage to a business associate of my late uncle, a man old enough to be my father who needed a young wife to manage his household and look presentable at social functions." She shrugged. "When I refused, she made it clear I was no longer welcome. Charles Morrison's letters seemed like Providence at the time. And now I think perhaps Providence knew what it was doing, even if the path was unconventional." She met his eyes. "I never would have found my way here otherwise." Before he could respond, the race marshal called for contestants to prepare. Buck had drawn a middle position, and Joanna watched as Matthew checked the saddle and spoke quietly to the horse. Other riders were younger, their mounts flashier. But Buck had something the others didn't: years of working cattle, of quick turns and sudden bursts of speed when needed. The race itself was a quarter-mile sprint around the square. When the starting gun fired, Buck broke clean and fast, Matthew low over his neck. They were third at the first turn, second at the halfway point. Coming into the final stretch, Matthew gave Buck his head, and the horse responded with a surge of speed that brought them even with the leader, a bay stallion ridden by the banker's nephew. The crowd pressed forward as the horses thundered toward the finish. Joanna found herself shouting encouragement, propriety forgotten. Buck stretched out, finding another gear, and crossed the finish line a head in front of the bay. Matthew's grin as he slowed Buck to a walk was boyish, transforming his usually serious face. He swung down from the saddle and was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Through the crowd, his eyes found Joanna's, and his grin widened. "I think Margaret was right about that horse." Judge Harper laughed, slapping Matthew on the back. "Always said Buck had racing blood in him somewhere." The mention of Margaret should have dimmed the moment, but somehow it didn't. She was part of the ranch's story, part of what made Matthew who he was. Joanna was beginning to understand that loving someone properly meant accepting all of them, including the ghosts they carried. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activities. Joanna found herself judging the preserves contest alongside the minister's wife, who seemed to have reconsidered her position on fallen women. Matthew won second place in the shooting competition and bid successfully on a quilt made by the church ladies to support the school fund. When the dancing began as sunset approached, he appeared at her elbow. "Would you dance with me, Miss Hart?" The question was formally posed, but his eyes held warmth that made her pulse quicken. "People will talk." "Let them." He offered his hand. "I haven't danced since, well, in a long time. Seems fitting to start again today." The fiddle player struck up a waltz, and Matthew led her into the cleared space serving as a dance floor. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps as if they'd done this before. Around them, other couples joined in, and gradually the stares became less pointed, the whispers less harsh. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For today, for making me feel like I belong here." His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "You do belong here. The town just needed reminding." As they turned through the dance, Joanna caught sight of their reflection in the general store window, Matthew in his black suit, her in burgundy wool, moving together in easy harmony. They looked right together, she thought, not trying to replace what was lost, but building something new. The song ended, but Matthew didn't immediately release her. "Joanna," he said quietly, "I need you to know what's growing between us. It's not about forgetting Margaret or finding a replacement. It's about two people who understand loss finding something worth holding on to." She finished. "I know. Matthew, I know." He smiled then, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered features. "Would you honor me with another dance?" As the music started again and he swept her back into motion, Joanna was aware of eyes watching, tongues wagging, judgments being made and remade, but surrounded by the warmth of Matthew's careful hold, the approving nods from unexpected allies, and the golden light of autumn sunset. She found she truly didn't care. Let them talk. She'd found something worth far more than their approval, a place to belong, work that mattered, and a man learning to dance again despite the weight of memory. The stars were coming out as they finally made their way back to the wagon, Buck trailing behind with his blue ribbon fluttering from his bridle. Tomorrow there would be chores and challenges and probably new gossip to navigate. But tonight, as Matthew helped her onto the wagon seat and their hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary, Joanna felt nothing but gratitude for the winding path that had brought her here. The morning after the harvest festival dawned cold and gray, with the smell of coming snow in the air. Joanna was cleaning Buck's hooves when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the barn door, she saw 3 riders dismount in the yard: Reverend Bennett, Harold Foster from the bank, and Walter Hardin, who owned the largest cattle spread in the county. Matthew emerged from the house, his expression carefully neutral. "Gentlemen, what brings you out this early?" "We need to talk. Colton." Foster's voice carried clearly across the yard. "About the situation here." What situation would that be? Matthew's tone was mild, but Joanna saw his hands clench slightly. "You know very well what situation." Reverend Bennett dismounted, his black coat flapping in the wind. "Your appearance at the festival yesterday with that woman was the final straw. Dancing together, acting as if—" "As if what?" Matthew interrupted. "As if we're neighbors, as if Miss Hart is a respectable woman who's worked honestly for months while your congregation spread lies about her." Joanna set down the hoof-pick and moved closer to the door, staying just out of sight. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "She's living in sin under your roof," Bennett's voice rose. "It's an abomination, a mockery of your poor wife's memory." "Careful, Reverend." Matthew's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You're on my property now. Choose your words wisely." Hardin stepped forward, playing peacemaker. "Now, Matthew, no need for threats. We're here as concerned citizens. The bank has certain concerns about the moral character of its loan holders, and several families have said they won't do business with someone who flaunts propriety so boldly." "Is that so?" Matthew crossed his arms. "And I suppose you three have a solution to offer." Foster cleared his throat. "The woman needs to go. Today. We'll even pay her stage fare back east, just to avoid any unpleasantness. Alternatively," Bennett added, "you could make an honest woman of her, marry the girl and put an end to the scandal. It's not ideal, given her origins, but it would satisfy propriety." The silence stretched out, heavy with tension. When Matthew finally spoke, his voice was like iron. "Let me make something clear. Gentlemen, Miss Hart is my employee. She lives in the barn lean-to, not my house. She works harder than any hand I've had, and she's earned her place here through honest labor. I won't send her away to satisfy your pearl-clutching, and I sure as hell won't force her into marriage to quiet your tongues." "Then you leave us no choice," Foster said stiffly. "The bank will be reviewing your loan terms. You may find them less favorable going forward. And I'll be speaking to my congregation about avoiding business with those who harbor immoral women," Bennett added. "And my cattle association members might think twice about buying horses from a man who can't maintain proper standards." Hardin finished. Matthew took a step forward, and all three men instinctively moved back. "You do what you think you must, but if any of you set foot on my property again without legitimate business, I'll have Sheriff Cooper arrest you for trespassing. Now get off my land." The men mounted hastily, Foster calling back, "You're making a mistake. Colton, that woman will be your ruin." After they'd gone, Matthew stood in the yard for a long moment, hands clenched at his sides. Joanna emerged from the barn, her own anger making her voice shake. "I'll pack my things." He spun around. "You'll do no such thing." "Matthew, they'll destroy you. The bank, the church, the cattle association, you can't fight them all. Watch me." He stalked past her into the barn, grabbed a pitchfork, and began attacking the hay with unnecessary violence. "I've had enough of their moral posturing. Bennett's been skimming from the collection plate for years. Foster foreclosed on the Widow Palmer's farm last winter, knowing she had nowhere to go, and Hardin's been altering his cattle brands to claim mavericks that aren't his." Joanna blinked at the revelations. "How do you know all this?" "Margaret knew everything that went on in this county. She kept records, wrote things down." He paused in his work. "Never used the information, said knowledge was just for protection, not for hurting folks. But if they want to play dirty—" "No." Joanna put her hand on his arm. "Don't become like them because of me. Margaret wouldn't want that." He looked at her hand, then up at her face. "What would you have me do, send you away, marry you to shut them up?" The word marry hung between them, charged with possibility. Joanna's cheeks heated, but she held his gaze. "I won't be forced into anything, and I won't let you be either, but I won't stand by and watch them destroy everything you've built." "Then what?" She took a deep breath. "Let me talk to them, to their wives, specifically Mrs. Holbrook isn't the only woman in this town who's tired of the hypocrisy." Over the next days, Joanna put her plan into action. She called first on Mrs. Martinez at the boarding house, then the school teacher Miss Davis, then Mrs. Bradley from the neighboring ranch. Each woman had her own story, a daughter sent away in disgrace, a sister trapped in an unwanted marriage, a friend destroyed by gossip. Joanna didn't ask for support directly. She simply shared her own story and listened to theirs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Catherine Morrison arrived at the ranch with her sister-in-law. Charles's wife, a thin, nervous woman named Ellen, whom nobody had seen in months. "Tell her what you told me," Catherine urged gently. Ellen's story came out in halting sentences. Charles had done this before, many times. The women he lured west either became his mistresses or were sold to the highest bidder among the saloons and worse establishments. Ellen had tried to leave, but he'd threatened her family back east. "I have letters," Ellen whispered. "Proof of what he's done. Names, dates, even some involving prominent men in town, men who were his clients." Joanna felt sick, but kept her voice steady. "Would you be willing to share those letters with Sheriff Cooper?" I can't. Charles left town 2 days ago," Catherine interrupted. "Heading for Colorado, supposedly, but he won't get far. I wired the authorities about his schemes." That evening, Joanna told Matthew what she'd learned. His face darkened with each revelation, and when she mentioned the prominent men involved, his jaw clenched tight. "Foster," he said grimly. "And probably Bennett, too. That's why they're so eager to run you off. They're afraid of what you might know or find out. Ellen Morrison has proof, if she's brave enough to use it." A knock at the kitchen door interrupted them. Sheriff Cooper stood on the porch, his weathered face grim. "Matthew, Miss Hart, I need to speak with you both." He told them Charles Morrison had been arrested in Denver. The authorities had found extensive correspondence documenting his trafficking schemes. Several prominent Dustwell citizens were implicated, including our banker and minister, Cooper said dryly. "Seems they were getting a finder's fee for sending desperate women Morrison's way. Foster's already on a train to anywhere else. Bennett's locked in his house, refusing to come out." "What about the women Charles hurt?" Joanna asked. "We're trying to locate them. Some may testify if we can guarantee their safety." Cooper turned his hat in his hands. "Miss Hart, I'll need your statement about your experience. And Matthew, I owe you an apology. Should have looked into this sooner instead of listening to gossip." After the sheriff left, Matthew and Joanna sat in the kitchen, processing the day's revelations. The threat to the ranch had evaporated with Foster's flight. Bennett's congregation would need a new minister. The town's power structure had shifted in ways nobody could have predicted. "You did this," Matthew said quietly. "You got those women to trust you, to speak up. They were already tired of the hypocrisy. They just needed someone to listen." She studied her hands, work roughened but steady. "I know what it's like to have no voice, to be judged for circumstances beyond your control." "Joanna," he covered her hands with his own. "What you've done, Margaret would have been proud. She always said the women in this town needed to stand together instead of tearing each other down." They sat in silence, hands linked across the table. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer shadowed by threats and judgment. "They were right about one thing," Matthew said eventually. "This situation, it can't continue indefinitely." Joanna's heart sank, but she kept her voice level. "I understand. If you need me to—" "No." His hands tightened on hers. "That's not what I meant. I meant that you deserve better than a lean-to in the barn. You deserve a real home, recognition for all you do here. You deserve—" He paused, struggling with words. "You deserve to be asked properly, not forced by gossip or propriety. When I ask you, if I ask you, it'll be because we both want it, not because the town demands it. And if you ask," her voice was barely above a whisper, "then I hope you'll say yes, but not today. Not with the town in upheaval and both of us reeling from what's happened. We deserve time to be sure, to build something solid without outside pressure." Joanna turned her hands in his, interlacing their fingers. "Time sounds good. We've got plenty of it now." As the snow continued to fall, transforming the ranch into something clean and new, they sat together in the warm kitchen, hands linked, hearts cautiously opening The town's judgment had nearly broken them. Instead, it had revealed the rot beneath Dustwell's respectable facade and cleared the way for something better for the town, for the silenced women finding their voices, and for two wounded souls discovering that trust could grow in the most unlikely soil. The snow had melted into mud by the time Ellen Morrison's testimony sent shockwaves through Dustwell. Two more prominent citizens hastily departed for business opportunities elsewhere. The new minister, Reverend Paul Hartley from Wisconsin, proved to be a younger man with progressive ideas about charity meaning more than judgment. And the bank sent a new manager from Kansas City who seemed more interested in sound investments than moral policing. Through it all, Joanna continued her work at the Triple C, the routine of caring for the horses, mending tack, and maintaining the barn provided stability while the town resettled itself. She and Matthew had fallen into a new rhythm, still employer and employee in the daylight hours, but sharing coffee and conversation in the evenings, building something careful and deliberate. It was a Thursday morning when everything shifted again. Joanna was brushing silver when she heard familiar voices in the yard. Her hand stilled on the brush as she recognized the cultured tones of her Aunt Constance. "I'm looking for my niece, Joanna Hart. I was told she might be found here." Through the barn door, Joanna could see her aunt standing beside a hired carriage, looking deeply out of place in her Philadelphia finery against the Kansas mud. Beside her stood a man Joanna recognized with a sinking heart, Mr. Terrence Blackwood, the business associate her aunt had wanted her to marry. Matthew emerged from the house, his expression carefully neutral. "Can I help you folks?" "I am Mrs. Constance Fairworth, and this is Mr. Blackwood. We've come to retrieve my wayward niece." Her aunt's voice dripped disapproval as she took in the ranch. "I cannot imagine what she's doing in this rustic establishment, but her foolishness has gone on long enough." "If you're referring to Miss Hart, she's employed here," Matthew said evenly. "And she's a grown woman, free to make her own choices." "Mr. Blackwood stepped forward. His chest puffed with self-importance. "See here, my good man, Miss Hart is engaged to me. Whatever arrangement you have with her—" "I'm engaged to no one." All three turned as Joanna emerged from the barn. She'd traded her usual work clothes for a simple but respectable dress, as if she'd known this day would come eventually. Her chin was high, her shoulders straight. "Joanna!" Aunt Constance gasped. "Look at you brown as a field hand. What have you done to yourself?" "I've been working, Aunt, earning an honest living." Joanna kept her voice steady though her heart raced. "Something I wouldn't have needed to do if you hadn't made it clear I was unwelcome in your home unless I married Mr. Blackwood." "Don't be dramatic, child. I merely suggested an advantageous match. You threatened to turn me out if I didn't accept him." Joanna met her aunt's eyes directly. "Well, I've been turned out, and I've survived. Thrived, even." Blackwood moved toward her, his face flushed. "Joanna, darling, surely you see now what a mistake you've made. Come back with us. I'm still willing to marry you, despite this lapse in judgment." "How magnanimous." Joanna's voice was dry as dust. "But I must decline. Again." "You're being ridiculous," Aunt Constance snapped. "What possible future could you have here working like a common laborer, living in—" "Where do you live?" "Exactly." Her eyes narrowed as she looked between Joanna and Matthew. "Oh, I see. You've become this man's—" "Employee." Matthew stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Joanna and her relatives. "Miss Hart works with my horses and has quarters in the barn lean-to. Everything's proper and above board, which is more than I can say for folks who'd force a woman into marriage against her will." Blackwood bristled. "How dare you speak to us that way? Do you have any idea who I am?" A man who can't take no for an answer, apparently. Matthew's voice was mild, but his stance suggested barely leashed tension. "The lady's made her position clear. I think it's time you folks headed back to town." "Joanna," Her aunt tried once more. Be sensible. You're throwing away security, respectability, a proper place in society. I have security here. I earn my wages and pay my way. I have respectability, I work hard and harm no one. And as for society, Joanna gestured to the ranch around them. I've found better society among honest ranchers and their horses than I ever did in Philadelphia drawing rooms. If you leave with us now, all is forgiven. Aunt Constance said stiffly. If you stay, you're no longer my niece. I'll tell everyone you're dead. The words should have hurt, but Joanna found they didn't. Not anymore. Then mourn me if you must, Aunt, but I'm more alive here than I ever was in your house. Blackwood made one last attempt, reaching for Joanna's arm. Don't be a fool, girl. You're coming with us. Matthew's hand clamped down on Blackwood's wrist before he could touch her. The lady said no. Touch her without permission, and you'll be picking yourself up out of the mud. For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Then Blackwood yanked his arm free, straightening his coat with offended dignity. This isn't over. A woman can't simply— Yes, she can. Sheriff Cooper appeared around the corner of the barn, badge glinting in the morning sun. Heard there might be some trouble out here, these folks bothering you. Miss Hart. They were just leaving, Joanna said quietly. Weren't you— Aunt Constance? Her aunt's face was pinched with fury and embarrassment. You've made your choice. Then don't come crying to me when this all falls apart. I won't. Joanna's voice was steady as bedrock. Goodbye, Aunt. The carriage departed in a cloud of dust and indignation. Sheriff Cooper tipped his hat and rode off, but not before giving Matthew an approving nod. Suddenly, the yard felt very quiet. You all right? Matthew asked softly. Joanna realized she was trembling, but not from fear or regret. It was more like the shaking that came after setting down a heavy load. She was my only family. Not much of one, but still, family's more than blood. He hesitated, then put a gentle hand on her shoulder. You've got people here who care about you. Mrs. Holbrook, the Bradleys, Catherine Morrison, even Cooper, apparently. And you— The question slipped out before she could stop it. His hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. Especially me. They stood there for a moment, the morning sun warming their faces, the familiar sounds of the ranch around them. Finally, Joanna drew a deep breath and stepped back. I should get back to work. Silver's only half brushed. Joanna— Matthew's voice stopped her. What you did just now, choosing this life, choosing to stay, that took courage. Or foolishness. I just turned down financial security and social position for a lean-to in a barn. You turned down a cage for freedom, he corrected. That's never foolish. That evening, Matthew invited her to take supper in the house instead of carrying a plate back to her quarters. They ate in companionable silence at first, both processing the day's events. Did you mean what you told them? Matthew asked eventually. About being more alive here. Every word. Joanna set down her fork. In Philadelphia, I was slowly suffocating. Expected to be decorative, silent, obedient. Here, I work hard and sleep sound. I know I'm useful. The horses don't care about my social standing, and neither do the people who matter. Is that enough, knowing you're useful? She considered the question. For now, yes, I'm building something here, skills, friendships, self-reliance. That's more than I ever had before. And when it's not enough anymore? Their eyes met across the table. The question hung between them, full of possibility and promise. Joanna felt her cheeks warm but didn't look away. Then I suppose we'll see what comes next. Matthew nodded slowly. I suppose we will. Later, as Joanna walked back to her lean-to, she thought about bridges burned and choices made. Her aunt would tell Philadelphia society she was dead, and perhaps that was fitting. The girl who'd believed pretty letters and dreamed of romance was gone. In her place stood a woman who could gentle a spooked horse, mend a bridle, and faced down the aunt who'd terrorized her for years. The stars were brilliant overhead, unmarred by city smoke. From the barn, Silver nickered a greeting, "In the house." Lamplight glowed warm through the windows. This wasn't the life Joanna had planned, but increasingly, she couldn't imagine wanting any other. She paused at her door, looking back at the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see Matthew moving about, probably making his evening coffee. He glanced up as if sensing her gaze, and even across the yard. She felt the connection between them, patient, steady, growing stronger with each passing day. "If I sleep here tonight," she whispered to the prairie wind, remembering that first desperate night in the depot, "it's because I choose to, because this is home." The wind carried no judgment, only the scent of coming rain and the promise of another day's honest work. Joanna smiled and went inside, closing the door on her past and opening her heart to whatever tomorrow might bring. Snow fell gentle as a blessing on Christmas morning, transforming the Triple C Ranch into something from a fairy tale. Joanna woke early in her lean-to, frost painting delicate patterns on the window. 3 months had passed since her aunt's visit. 3 months of deepening connection with Matthew, of finding her place not just on the ranch, but in the community. She dressed carefully in the burgundy dress Mrs. Holbrook had given her, now altered to fit perfectly. Over it, she wrapped the new shawl she'd found on her doorstep 2 days prior, soft blue wool, store-bought, with no note but Matthew's careful wrapping unmistakable. The barn was warm with the breath of horses, all of them fed and watered the night before to allow a leisurely Christmas morning. Silver nickered softly as Joanna passed, and she paused to stroke the mare's neck. "Merry Christmas, old girl. Extra oats for you today." Outside, the world was hushed under its blanket of white. Smoke rose from the house chimney, and through the kitchen window, she could see Matthew moving about. Her heart did that peculiar little skip it had developed lately whenever she saw him. She knocked softly before entering. They'd developed these small courtesies over the months, respectful of boundaries even as those boundaries grew more permeable. Matthew turned from the stove, and his smile transformed his weathered features. "Merry Christmas, Joanna. Coffee's ready." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of cinnamon bread Mrs. Holbrook's recipe, which Matthew had attempted with surprising success. On the table sat 2 packages wrapped in brown paper. "Sit," he said, pouring coffee into her favorite cup, the one with tiny painted flowers that had been Margaret's. Sometime in the past month, it had become hers without discussion or ceremony. Breakfast first, then presents. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from 2 people who've learned they don't need words to fill every space. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the world beyond the kitchen's warmth. "I have something for you," Joanna said when they'd finished, producing a carefully wrapped package from beneath her shawl. Matthew's eyes widened slightly. "Joanna, you didn't need to—" "Open it." Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. On the first page, she'd written in her careful hand, "For new memories." J. Matthew ran his fingers over the leather, throat working. "It's perfect. Thank you." He pushed one of his packages toward her. "Your turn." The first package contained leather work gloves, butter-soft and perfectly sized. The second, smaller package held something that made her breath catch, a silver hair comb decorated with tiny flowers, delicate as frost. "It was Margaret's," Matthew said quietly. "She'd want it used, not gathering dust in a drawer, and I'd like to see you wear it." Joanna's eyes burned with sudden tears. "Matthew, I couldn't—" "Yes, you can." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Margaret believed beautiful things should be used, enjoyed. She'd approve of you having it. With trembling fingers, Joanna tucked the comb into her hair. The weight of it felt significant, not heavy, but present, a blessing, perhaps, from a woman she'd never met but had come to know through the stories of those who'd loved her. "There's something else," Matthews said, suddenly seeming nervous. "Not a gift exactly, but a question." Joanna's heart began to pound. "Yes." "The lean-to's not winterized properly. You've made it work, but with the cold getting worse." He cleared his throat. "The house has 3 empty bedrooms. Margaret's sewing room could be yours. Still proper, you'd have your own space, but warm, comfortable. You deserve better than a barn in winter." It wasn't the question she'd half expected, but somehow it was better. An offer of comfort and care without pressure or assumption. "What would people say?" she asked, though she found she cared less about that with each passing day. "Let them say what they will, Mrs. Holbrook would still come twice a week. You'd have the whole 2nd floor to yourself, and—" He squeezed her hand gently. "I'd sleep better knowing you weren't freezing in that lean-to." "And if I accept what then?" His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Then we continue as we've been, building something steady, something real. And when the time's right, when we're both ready, we'll take the next step, whatever that looks like." Joanna turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking moments that felt suspended in amber. "I'll need help moving my things," she said finally. Matthew's smile was like sunrise after a long winter night. "I think I can manage that." They spent the afternoon transferring her few possessions to the sewing room. It was a corner room with windows facing both sunrise and sunset, filled with light even on this snowy day. The furniture was simple but well made, a brass bed with a quilted coverlet, a dresser with an oval mirror, a rocking chair by the window. "Margaret pieced that quilt the first year we were married," Matthews said from the doorway. "Said every home needed something made with love to make it real." "It's beautiful." Joanna smoothed her hand over the intricate pattern wedding ring design. She recognized, circles interlinked and endless. "This whole room is beautiful. It's yours now, for as long as you want it." The unspoken promise in those words made her throat tight. She crossed to where he stood, still careful not to enter without invitation, rising on her toes. She kissed his cheek, a brief touch, but their first, "Thank you, for the room, for the comb, for everything." His hand came up to touch where her lips had been, wonder in his eyes. "Joanna, I know," she smiled, feeling bold and sure. "Me too, when the time's right." That evening, they sat together in the parlor, another first. Matthew read aloud from a book of poetry while Joanna mended one of his shirts, the storm outside making their circle of lamplight feel like the whole world. When she yawned, he walked her to the stairs, taking her hand at the bottom. "Good night, Joanna. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Matthew." She climbed the stairs to her new room, Margaret's comb still in her hair, Matthew's gift warm around her heart. Below, she heard him banking the fire, the familiar sounds of a house settling for the night. But now she was part of those sounds, part of this home's rhythm. Standing at her window, she watched snow erase the path between house and barn, covering her old life in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be those who questioned, who judged. But tonight, warm and safe in a room given freely, wearing a comb blessed by memory and kindness, Joanna felt nothing but gratitude. She'd come west chasing a lie, slept in a freight shed out of desperation, taken work in a barn from necessity. But somehow, through all the wrong turns and harsh judgments, she'd found her way here to a home earned through honest work, a community built on real friendship, and a love growing patient and true as prairie grass. Outside her window, a lone star broke through the clouds, shining clear and bright over the snow-covered ranch. Joanna pressed her palm to the cold glass, thinking of another young woman who'd once looked out this window, who'd pieced quilts and named horses and loved a good man well. "Thank you," she whispered to Margaret's gentle ghost. "I'll take care of him, and he'll take care of me. We'll take care of each other." The star seemed to pulse brighter for a moment before clouds covered it again. But Joanna didn't need stars to guide her anymore. She was already home, already found, already choosing to stay not from desperation or lack of options, but from love. As she prepared for bed in her new room, she smiled at the thought of all the mornings to come coffee in the kitchen, work with the horses, quiet evenings by the fire, and someday, when they were both ready, new vows to make this arrangement permanent. But for now, this was enough, this gentle courtship, this mutual choosing, this promise of a future built on friendship and respect and love that grew stronger with each passing day. The wind sang around the eaves, and snow continued to fall, and in a warm room in a prairie house, Joanna Hart slept sound and deep, no longer asking not to be judged, but knowing herself loved exactly as she was. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share your location in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought of Joanna and Matthew's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience, redemption, and romance on the prairie, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover these authentic stories from America's frontier. Your support helps keep these historical romances alive for everyone who loves tales of courage, love, and second chances in the Old West.